This video analyzes the game played between Colle, who played with the white pieces, and Delvaux, who played with the black pieces. The code of the opening used was D05. This opening is called the Colle system with E6. Result: white won the game. What is the first move of the white player? White, pawn moves to d4. Modern players consider this to be one of the best opening moves. It is equal in value to 1.e4 in that two pieces are freed for action, while a pawn seizes a central square. The difference is that the d-pawn stands protected, whereas the e-pawn would be vulnerable to an early attack. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to d5. This move and one black knight moves to f6 are by far the most common replies to 1.d4. White must not be allowed to play 2.e4 and dominate the vital central squares with his pawns. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight moves to f3. This was an inaccuracy. So great an authority as Emanuel Lasker, world champion for 27 years, says of this move: "In my practice I have usually found it strongest to post the knights at b3, where they have a magnificent sway." Here b3 refers to the squares c3 and f3 for white, or c6 and f6 for black. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to f6. Black follows suit in trumps, developing his king's knight to its most useful square. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e3. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to c4. Generally, it is dubious strategy to release one bishop while shutting in the other. In this game, white is adopting a system that calls for a storing up of dynamic energy behind the lines, which is released at the right time by an explosion at the key c4 square. To this end, white develops so that his pieces exert their maximum pressure at e4. His bishop will therefore occupy d3, and his b1 knight will move to d2. If more concentration of force is needed, his queen will supply it by developing at e2, or he may play castles on the king's side followed by rook moves to e1. Then, with all this potential energy ready to let loose, the e-pawn advances to e4, to rip the position apart and open fire on black's king's side. Development in the Colle system is on positional lines, but the objective is a kingside attack. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to e6. This is a routine developing move which serves to maintain the symmetry but has the defect of not crossing white's plans. Clearly, it was better strategy either to attack white's pawn center by 3 black c5 or to counter by 3 black bishop moves to f5. Not only is this latter a simple, sound developing move, but also it prepares to oppose white's bishop, which is headed for d3, with an equal force. The exchange of bishops, which follows sooner or later, will deprive white of a most valuable weapon in kingside attacks. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to d3. Notice the difference. White's bishop commands a beautiful, and undisputed, diagonal, while black's c8 bishop, covering squares of the same color, is hemmed in by the e-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c5. Very good. Black strikes at the pawn formation in the center and gives his queen access to the queen side. This freeing move of the c-pawn is of the greatest importance in queen's pawn openings. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to c3. Move only one or two pawns in the opening, say all the authorities, but no principle must be followed uncompromisingly. This move permits white to meet the advance black c4 by bishop moves to e2, keeping the bishop lined up against black's king side. In the event that pawns are exchanged on d4, white can recapture with the e-pawn and free his c1 bishop. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to c6. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been pawn moves to b6, another good move. The knight comes into play toward the center, increasing the pressure on the d-pawn. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight from file b moves to d2. An odd-looking sortie. Not only does this knight block the paths of the queen and a bishop, but also the piece itself seems to be doing little good. Yet, an expert would make this move without a moment's hesitation. For one thing, the knight adds us weight to the pressure on the strategically important c4 square, the springboard of the coming attack. For another, it is mobilized once it gets off the back rank. Finally, it can hop out of the way of the queen and the bishop when it is expedient for it to do so. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to e7. Black brings another piece into play. Remember that the bishop is doing a job once it leaves the back rank, and prepares to get his king into safety by castling. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, castles on the king's side. The king flees to a less exposed sector, while the rook comes out of hiding. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to c4. This is the sort of move instinctively made by a beginner. Its purpose is to chase off an annoying piece from its favorable post. The move is weak because it releases the pressure on white's center. Tension must be maintained if black is to have something to say about affairs in this vital area. Counterplay in the center is the best means of opposing a kingside attack, and to secure counterplay, the pawn position must be kept fluid. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to c2. Naturally the bishop retreats, but stays on the diagonal leading to the c4 square, where the break will come. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to b5 primarily to make room at b7 for his light-squared bishop, but also with an eye to making trouble with the possible advance of his queenside pawns. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to e4. The key move in this opening. It will open up lines for an attack by white's pent-up pieces. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file d takes at e4. This was an inaccuracy. A better move would have been castles on the king's side, not an attractive choice for black, but he cannot have the threat of the e5 advance, displacing his knight and severely cramping his movements, perpetually hanging over his head. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at e4. With this recapture, white's pieces that were crouched in the background spring into play. White has the initiative and a commanding position in which to exercise it. If no immediate attacking opportunities present themselves, he can quietly put on more pressure by queen moves to e2, rook moves to e1, bishop moves to f4, or bishop moves to g5, and rad1, and wait for black's game to crack. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, castles on the king's side. It might have been wiser to postpone castling, contrary to usual principles, as white is poised for an attack in that direction. This is another case where the value of a precept is conditioned by circumstances. Black would do better to try for counterplay by 10. Black queen moves to c7 followed by 11. Black bishop moves to b7 and 12. Black rook moves to d8. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e2. This developing move also threatens to win a piece. The idea is 12. Knight takes at f6, check. Bishop takes at f6 13. Queen moves to e4, and the threat of mate on the king side wins the exposed knight on the queen side. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to b7. Black guards his knight while developing another piece. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight from file f moves to g5 threatening the deadly 13. Knight takes at f6, check. Bishop takes at f6 14. Bishop takes at h7, check. King moves to h8 15. Queen moves to h5. Why an exclamation mark for a simple threat which is so easily countered? Why glorify this move when black can not only save the pawn but also cause white to lose time? Black simply moves the h-pawn one square, rescues the pawn, and forces white's knight to retreat. The answer to these questions is that white's purpose with his brilliant knight move is to compel one of the pawns defending the king to step forward. The secret of conducting a successful kingside attack is to create a breach in the cordon of pawns surrounding the enemy king, to induce or force one of the pawns to move. The change in the lineup of pawns fixes the defense with a permanent weakness. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to h6. Touch the pawns before your king with only infinite delicacy, says Saint-Cyr. But, alas, it's too late. Black must disturb the pawn position. Had he tried 12, black knight takes at e4, the recapture by 13. Queen takes at e4 threatens mate, and compels 13. Black g6 and the pawns are disarranged. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at f6 check, destroying the f6 knight, the best defender of a castled position. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at f6. The alternative 13. Black pawn from file g takes at f6 loses quickly. White could win either by gobbling up pawns with 14. Knight takes at e6. Pawn from file f takes at e6 15. Queen moves to g4, check. King moves to h8, 15. Black king moves to f7 16. Queen moves to g6, checkmate. 16. Queen moves to g6 f5 17. Queen takes at h6, check. King moves to g8 18. Queen takes at e6, check. And the f-pawn falls next, or with 14. Knight moves to h3, threatening 15. Bishop takes at h6, 14. Black king moves to g7 15. Bishop takes at h6, check. King takes at h6 16. Queen moves to e3, check. King moves to g7 17. Queen moves to g3, check. King moves to h8 18. Queen moves to h4, check. followed by 19. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to e4 threatening instant mate. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn moves to g6 making room for the king's escape by 14. Black rook moves to e8 does not look inviting, as after 15. Queen moves to h7, check. King moves to f8 16. Knight moves to e4. White's attack appears dangerous. However, it is preferable to black's actual move, which stops the queen coming any closer, but alters the pawn configuration. This change in the pawn formation saddles black with a weakness that is organic, and one that can turn out to be fatal. All this is encouraging to white, but how does he proceed? How does he exploit the weaknesses in black's position? Above all, what does he do about his knight which is still under attack? Shall it retreat abjectly? Before moving the knight back to f3 mechanically and unthinkingly, white looks carefully at the situation. The opportunity to strike a decisive blow may be here at this very moment, but one hasty obvious move may give black just enough breathing time to reorganize his defenses. This is the position, and here is how white reasons out his attack. The key point must be black's g-pawn, which guards his king from invasion. If anything happens to this pawn, if it is captured, the defense crumbles, and I can break into the fortress. How do I go about removing it from the board? The g-pawn is protected by the f-pawn. Suppose I destroy its support by sacrificing my knight for the f-pawn? After 15. Knight takes at f7, king takes at f7, or 15. Black rook takes at f7, 16. Queen takes at g6, check. And I have two pawns for my knight, with a third one in sight, as the h-pawn must tall. Material is then approximately even, but his position is completely broken up, and clinching the win should be easy. This might be the general plan, but before putting it in motion, white analyzes the combination for possible flaws and comes up with this. After 15. Knight takes at f7, rook takes at f7, bringing another piece to the defense, 16. Queen takes at g6, check. Rook moves to g7, 17. Queen takes at h6, knight takes at d4, suddenly black is the aggressor. He threatens mate in 2 by 18. Black knight moves to e2, check. 19. King moves to h1, bishop takes at g2, checkmate. As well as outright ruin by 18. Black rook takes at g2, check. Followed by a deadly discovered check. Clearly this line of play is too dangerous. Is there another way to break through, without letting black's rook come into the game? Can I get rid of the f-pawn without disturbing the rook? It is important that I remove this pawn, as it supports the g-pawn and the e-pawn. Wait a minute. There is a clue in the last sentence. The f-pawn, guarding two other pawns, is serving two masters. Obviously it is overworked. I must add to its burden by luring it away from its present important post. Therefore, what do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, knight takes at e6. The knight captures a pawn and attacks queen and rook. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, pawn from file f takes at e6, this was a blunder, a better move would have been knight takes at d4, black must accept the sacrifice or lose rook and pawn for the knight. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen takes at g6 check, stronger than taking the c-pawn, after which black has 4 ways to get out of check. Each of these replies might lose, but it is more practical to attack the enemy with blows that leave him little choice of reply. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop moves to g7, the only move, since 16 black king moves to h8 walks right into mate. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to h7 check, white has other attractive continuations in 17. Bishop takes at h6 or 17. Queen takes at e6, check. But this forces the king out into the open where white's other pieces can get at him. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to f7, the only move. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to g6 check, stronger than 18. Bishop takes at h6, to which black retorts 18, black queen moves to f6 followed by 19, black rook moves to h8. The text move keeps him on the run. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, king moves to f6, certainly not 18, black king moves to e7, when 19. Queen takes at g7, check. Let's white pick up a couple of bishops. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop moves to h5, white is still angling for 20. Queen moves to g6, check. King moves to e7, 21. Queen takes at g7, check. When both black bishops come off the hoard. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, knight moves to e7, this was a mistake, a better move would have been queen moves to d5, the only way to prevent the queen check. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, bishop takes at h6. White is not playing to pick up stray pawns, but to bring another piece into the attack. The pawn that is added to the collection is incidental to the general scheme of things. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, rook moves to g8, this was a blunder. A better move would have been bishop takes at h6, to parry the threat of 21. Queen takes at g7, check. King moves to f5 22. Queen moves to e5, checkmate. On 20 black bishop takes at h6 white intended 21. Queen takes at h6, check. King moves to f5 22. Ray 1, when the threat of mate either by the rook or the g-pawn is decisive. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, pawn moves to h4. The new threat is 22. Bishop moves to g5, checkmate. What do you think it was the next move of the black player? Black, bishop takes at h6 loses on the spot, but there was no defense for black. If 21 black e5, then 22. Bishop takes at g7, check. Rook takes at g7 23. Pawn from file d takes at e5, check. And the king must abandon the rook. What do you think it was the next move of the white player? White, queen moves to f7 checkmate, checkmate.